Hello and welcome back to Heights Library's podcast, Unpacking 1619, where you can explore the interviews we've collected with scholars from around the country, in which we unpack topics relating to race in America. I'm your host, John Pichet, and I'm thrilled to share these interviews with you here. On today's episode, we talk to Antonia Hylton, a Peabody and two-time Emmy Award-winning correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC, on her new book, Madness, Race, and Insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum. Ms. Hylton's extensive research into Crownsville Hospital in Maryland, a segregated asylum that was both hospital and prison, serves as a physical example of racist systems and Black resistance. Tracing the history of Crownsville was difficult since so many of the official records were destroyed and those that remained were in rough shape. She turned to oral history of those nurses and staff that worked there to describe the community that formed under the oppressive systems of white supremacy within Crownsville. Built by the very patients it was meant to treat, underfunded by the state and neglected by the medical establishment, patients and staff of Crownsville serve as an example of hope in the face of neglect and kindness in the shadow of fear.
Hi, my name is Antonia Hylton, and I'm the author of Madness, Race, and Insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum. And I'm also a correspondent and journalist for NBC News and MSNBC. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for writing such a powerful and impactful book about, I think, something that we don't talk enough about in the historical record, which is, asylums, madness, and those people who are locked in institutions and for the most part forgotten. So I would love for you to begin by telling us how you came to this subject and how you came to write this book.
Well, I came to this story and to this book as a teenager. I was in my freshman year in college, and I stumbled into a class called Madness in Medicine. And it was all about the history of psychiatry, something that as a child I didn't even know somebody could study. And I fell in love with these stories, with the understanding, with the development of our mental health care systems. But I was surprised to find that so much of that history is told almost exclusively from the perspective of white European patients and white American patients. And I knew something was wrong with that because I grew up in a very big Black family here in the United States that had a long history of mental trauma. And I had loved ones, people in my own family who had spent time in institutions like Crownsville, which is the hospital at the center of madness. And so I knew they were missing and they just weren't part of our teachings of the historical record. And when I went looking for more and trying to find some of myself and my own family in this work, I came across a monograph that in just a couple paragraphs mentioned the existence of this place called Crownsville. And soon I discovered that the buildings, the land was still standing, still present in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, that there were generations of people who had lived and worked here, and they were still alive, many of them in their 80s and 90s. And there was this opportunity, too, to access remaining records that the state had rescued when the hospital closed in 2004, within our lifetimes. So a very close history. And so to me, it felt like the work called me to it, both as a sort of personal project, a healing project, coming from the kind of family that I come from, but also an academic and a journalistic exercise and an opportunity to tell a story that I think so many Americans in this moment want to have, especially coming out of the pandemic. I think every American, every person in this country now has a touch point for the mental health crisis. They know a loved one who has struggled to find care or who has gone to get care somewhere and not received what they needed or deserved. And so I think we want to have this conversation, but so often we don't have the words, we don't know the language, we don't know our history, certainly. And so my hope was that madness and this very personal journey I've been on for the last 10, 11 years now, that it would give people a place to start that dialogue.
Well, and I really appreciated the chapters that dealt with your family and your ancestral kind of history going back a couple of generations and even more recently, because it really does center the story in the contemporary and how it is factoring in today. But by also then going and talking to these people who work there and amplifying and recording their voices, you bring to life something that is so often forgotten in history, which are the people who lived it. And I would love for you to begin by telling us, we'll get back to their stories and what they have to tell us, but what was Crownsville and how did it function in the asylum system of the United States as a hospital and as a criminal prison?
Well, Crownsville was founded in 1911, and it is, to me, this very strange and unique story, but also such an American story, because it begins like this. 12 Black men suffering with various mental illnesses are brought into the forest one day in March of 1911 by a white doctor and other state officials. And they arrive to what is supposed to be a place for their mental health care treatment, but there is no hospital. There are no rooms. There are no facilities. They are told that they have to begin the work of building those structures from the very ground all the way up. And they start to do that. And week after week, more men arrive and join them in what becomes a sort of plantation style work colony. And one of the things I explore in the early part of the book is the way in which this origin story, this genesis for Crownsville, it is odd because they are the only group of patients ever forced to build themselves an asylum before they can benefit from the treatment. But it is also very American in that when you look at what doctors and politicians were saying about Black people in the decades right after emancipation, in some ways, this is not a surprise. They are writing in medical journals and in letters all about their theories of the minds and bodies of Black people and how they believe that Black people in some ways really can't mentally handle being free. And so the cause of mental illness in many Black populations, in their view, was emancipation. It was the rigors and the difficulties of daily life. And so they decide they need to create a place to treat them, but they don't want to bring them into the existing white hospitals. So they begin to create places like Crownsville all across the country. And Crownsville goes a step further in making patients run this farm, run this work cooperative, even once the hospital is constructed. And these buildings still stand, by the way. They're more than a century old now, but they're still there. And I think that tells you a lot about the craftsmanship and the skill of the patients who are doing so much of this work. But they then run a highly modern and productive farm. They then run the laundry and the morgue and all parts of the hospital's operations to offset the costs of their own care. And in many ways, what we find in the records, but also in the oral history and in the stories passed on through generations of Black families in Maryland, is that this place really was like it was the plantation structure. It was to some the good old days. And it's an interesting way to see, just from those early years, the way in which the medical field viewed Black patients and really viewed their health as being very closely tied to their capacity to labor, to produce, to have value to the state of Maryland. And all of that is right there in those early years. And I show how in each era that comes after, each era builds upon the one that came before it. And you really see that. So in those early years, you have the plantation structure. By the mid 20th century, some of that work and abuse starts to fall away. But the hospital has never received the same level of funding that the other hospitals around the state have. So it's constantly struggling to be accredited, to meet expectations. Black employees start arriving and they're horrified to see the way that white employees, many of whom had bigoted views of the patients they were supposed to serve, how they'd been treating them. So it takes a really long time to make a lot of these adjustments and to start meeting therapeutic goals at the institution. And so even by the time that you're in 2004, and so much has changed in the mental health care field and changed at Crownsville, that founding, the decisions that the state made about Crownsville and what it deserved, how much money they would spend, how they would treat its patients, it really haunts the hospital for the entirety of its life.
Well, and I know you don't make this point explicit in the book, but what you just were talking about is kind of that systemic racist building blocks that come out of slavery, that continue to mold and shape the Black experience in America. And not only does the Black experience have to build itself, but it also has to fund and sustain itself. And in many ways, this is the story of how that systemic racism perpetuates itself even today. But I was interested, my next question is interested in the segregationist influence on this institution, because I think we kind of forget just how segregated even the North was in this period of between the wars, basically.
Absolutely. I think often people think about Jim Crow and they think water fountains, parks, schools, some of these very obvious spaces. We've seen a lot of the photographs from that period in time, or we hear the stories from our grandparents. But Jim Crow seeped into everything. And it affected the institutions that we built in the medical field, and it affected the treatment that they believed people deserved. And so, one of the things that you see in the writings and in the beliefs of white doctors at the time is that putting Black people to work, putting them through intense agricultural, physical labor, is actually what's natural and best for them. That is healing. That is the state doing its part on behalf of Black patients. And so when you see that their peer white institutions are not using labor to the same extent, or not expecting those patients to produce as much for them, it's because they view their health and what's right and best for those populations in a completely different way. And so really Jim Crow was, this physical apartheid, but also a medical apartheid, a psychological apartheid, a psychological separation. And so Black people are inhabiting these spaces and are affected by these spaces, but also by the attitudes that are walking into these spaces every single day. And one of the things I look at in the book is how Crownsville starts to take up space in the imaginations of both the Black and white community. And to the white community, it becomes this very fearful place. There's a lot of focus on young Black males and their potential violence or sort of sexuality and what might happen if Black males exit Crownsville and come into the broader community. But in the Black community, Crownsville has a sort of a sort of boogeyman, almost mythic sort of reputation. And there's all this talk of night doctors and these scary figures who parents and grandparents start to warn their children will come and scoop you off the streets at night and bring you to Crownsville. And it almost sounds like a Black community's folklore. But what I found through my research, through records and oral history, was that the folklore and the sort of line between fact and fiction gets really blurry, because some of those rumors were very much true. There were patients. I tell the story at one point of a male patient who ends up at Crownsville for years and years. And a Black female nurse discovers him in the early 50s. And she gets to know him and finds out that her white supervisor picked him up in Baltimore because he overheard the patient using a British accent and didn't believe that the accent was real. Well, this Black woman arrives and gets to know him and take care of him and see him as human, and finds out that he was born in London and had moved to the United States and was a jockey and had fallen on hard times. And so he had been literally scooped up off the streets with no real medical necessity, no actual mental health care diagnosis, and is lost to the hospital, lost to Crownsville. And these stories are really important because they show us the way in which an institution like an asylum, operating in the larger context of Jim Crow, becomes a place that's not just for actual medical care and treatment, but it really is almost a receptacle, a social tool to gather any kind of Black person seen as weird, strange, different, speaking funny, no longer welcome, and no longer able to get with the status quo. And that includes children as well. There are all kinds of children who end up at Crownsville, some who have emotional or learning disabilities, but many of whom just don't have parents or someone able to take care of them. And the local agencies and adoption groups aren't very interested in working with that population of children. And so they end up living in an adult-focused asylum. And it's both a story of the horror that comes with Jim Crow and that entire period in our country, but also a lot of the heroism and the bravery and the kindness of Black people who entered these spaces at their own risk and then fought day in and day out to save patient lives, to call their families, get them reconnected to care, to get them out of the hospital. And so the pain and the beauty and all of that was probably the most fascinating part of the reporting for me. And it was so important to gather oral history, because you really, if you only look at the perspectives in that period from providers and doctors who view their patients as less than human, you're not going to get an accurate story. You're not going to get the full story of their care. And so you really have to listen to what the Black community is saying, both in terms of fact, memory, and fiction, because they tell you a much broader picture of what did this institution actually mean and how did it operate in the state of Maryland.
Well, and some of those stories that you did in your oral history are incredible and, incredibly touching as well as harrowing. But I wanted you to talk a little bit too about what happened to the official records of Crownsville. So if someone were to ask, like, who was there and why, it would be very hard, or you found it was very hard to find that out without talking to people who were still living that were there, right?
That's right. And boy, it was not easy to get my hands on those records. And I think in part that was by design. So any institution like Crownsville was expected to keep records, about patients being admitted, being discharged, deaths, autopsy reports, clinical notes from doctors who would be interacting with patients out on the wards. And, I prepared for a long time to go through what's called an institutional review board process, essentially sort of an ethics exam. And a permission process through both Harvard University professors, but also the state of Maryland, in order to access all of this, with the expectation that, I would be coming across patient-sensitive and sort of highly personal information, and would need to have that training to know what to do and how to respectfully manage it. So after months and months of going through this process, which is not easy, not affordable, not simple and straightforward for any researcher or person to do, I finally get through it with the help of some advisors at Harvard, and I get into the archives, and I find out that all of the records before about 1960 have either been systematically destroyed or accidentally destroyed, as a result of very little care and planning around how to preserve the story of patients. And so what does end up surviving in many cases are the letters, the writings, the priorities of people who were running the institution, who again, for decades, didn't see their patients as fully human and as deserving of top level care. And so, you can read a lot about their concerns about things like the budget and the politics and reputation of Crownsville, their own resistance to integrating Crownsville. But if you're looking for the interior lives of patients, for the psychological experience of patients, stories of recovery, stories of failure, they're not there. And when you see that and you're faced with that, in many ways, I think the lack of material, the absence of their perspective speaks almost just as loud. But as a reporter, then my responsibility was to go and fill in the gaps, go to people's homes, and not just record them and my conversations with them, their memories, but I actually went through their attics and their basements and their personal photograph collections to bring new materials that the state had never really properly sought or organized, bring it into the fold and make it part of the story. And in doing that work, I came across unbelievable records. I mean, one man named Paul Lurs, who worked at the hospital for 40 years and in many ways, just such a hero in the Annapolis and Baltimore areas. He rescued so much of the material from the hospital, just sort of in his own split-second decision. He keeps it in his own fireproof cabinet in the hospital's final days in around 2003, 2004. He gives a lot of it to the archives, but he also keeps a lot at home. And I found patient poetry, original photographs, letters, reflections from interns who came and spent brief amounts of time at Crownsville and had their criticisms of the institution. I mean, you could just see so much of the texture, and you could really bring this institution to life by marrying all these different types of sources together. And that was a very important, but also cool thing. I think people sometimes they discount oral history and memory as unreliable. But in my view, especially when you're looking at a period like Jim Crow, writings and records are just as unreliable or bigoted. And so you really need to figure out the balance, the way to get all these records to complement and support each other, not fight with or overshadow each other. And that was one of the most enjoyable challenges of this work, was how do you weave all these things together and really tell an accurate story here. But I tell people, I don't think I could have finished this book with less than 10 years time, because of just the amount of time that takes to find these sources, to build relationships that people trust you and want you to come into their homes. I mean, there are people in this book that waited 5 to 7 years to agree to speak to me because of what they had been subjected to, or what they remembered, or what they saw. And so it takes time to build those relationships, to uncover all of this. And 19-year-old, 20-year-old me in those early days probably was very frustrated and angry. Not probably, I know I was. But the process afterward, the sort of fight to get all that was out there, ended up being really, really rewarding too.
Well, and one of the greatest things I think you did was you talked to psych nurses. And as the son of a psych nurse, I know how difficult they can be sometimes. So but I would love for you to tell us about the people who integrated Crownsville, the staff that went in there, and what they faced trying to help people who looked like them and came from the same background from them, and how that was rewarding, but at the same time challenging and sometimes traumatic.
Oh yeah, it's a very messy period of history. And this is another part of the American story that I think gets a little bit whitewashed and oversimplified, right? We think about Ruby Bridges, so we think about these heroes, they enter, or maybe they lead a march, and then something changes and America improved. And there's some truth to that narrative, but often there were children or young adults put in the position of being pioneers in workplaces and schools all around our country, who were really carrying the weight of this fight on their shoulders alone, without a lot of protection, support, and often without colleagues who really liked them or welcomed them into these institutions. And so many of these people are still alive today. And so it was an honor, frankly, for me to get to know dozens of women and men who were some of the first Black people in the state of Maryland to become doctors and nurses, to get jobs at a hospital, to become employees of the state. And they arrive, some at the very end of the 40s, but really mostly in the 50s. They start getting their foot in the door, getting their first jobs as aides and attendants on these wards. And there starts to be this very strange power dynamic, frankly, where there are these white employees who've been at Crownsville for a very long time. They run the place and they are the supervisors. Then there's a new group, a class of Black employees who arrive, who are in their early 20s. They're very young. Some of them are just teenagers, actually. And they come into Crownsville and they're not in charge. They don't have a lot of power, but they do know their patient population very well. And one of the strange things is, they don't just look like them. They've gone to school with them. They know what church they go to. They go to the same restaurants and bars as their patients. So they really know them to a whole different level. And then at the bottom of that totem pole are the patients themselves. And there's all this friction and complication between these three groups. And in particular for Black employees who are new and so young at that time, it's a very messy moment, because they're trying to do what's right by their patients. They're horrified. They see extreme filth and overcrowding and physical abuse all around them. And they're angry at their white supervisors for all of this. But they're also very desperate to keep their jobs, to keep their careers, to feed their families. And so they have to figure out how to operate, how to collaborate, to push, to change the people they're working with, and also to take care of the patients. But what ends up happening to them is that for every person they rescue, they save, there's often a moment, when I would interview some of these women, they would still break down in tears about some of the stuff that they saw, about patients who they couldn't save, and outcomes they wish they could have prevented. And so, I think that's part of why it took some of them so long to agree to talk, to be ready to put their stories into the record, because they were still wrestling, even at 80 and 90 years old, with, I I think questions that many people can relate to, this feeling, that you go to work and you wonder if there's a lot of bureaucracy and mess around me, am I still a good person if I work here? If I'm only doing a little bit of incremental good, am I a good person actually? But if I leave, if I quit this job, who's going to take my place? What could happen to these people? And so you're put in these very impossible positions, and you have to make different, very morally gray choices every single day. But what I've found is that so many of these longtime employees and Black women and men who arrive there, they really just ascribe to this idea that they had to dedicate themselves to doing what they could for each individual every day when they showed up. And I think, that's something that the state of Maryland is really starting to recognize and celebrate. But it's taken a very, very long time for those men and women to get their flowers. And I hope that this book, in telling their stories and the difficulty of what they encountered at work, but also the joy and the friendships they made and the cliques they developed and the parties they threw, that shows you sort of the richness of this history, and also just brings to life this period in American history that I think now gets kind of truncated and whitewashed and wrung out. And it really was an incredibly tumultuous period for this country, and you really see that through their lived experiences.
Well, and one of the things that I'll recommend the book for forever is your ability to situate that Black community within the white community and tell that story of self-care so profoundly, because that really did come through, where the community had to care for itself in spite of the segregation that they felt in the institution, and then going home, leaving the institution. So that you did a great job of that. It's
Thank you.
I would love for you to kind of wrap us up with kind of a short overview of what happened to Crownsville, because it's very much a story of what happened to these kinds of institutions in American society, right?
Yeah. Well, Crownsville closes in 2004, and in some ways, it actually lasts longer than a lot of other institutions like it. But it's a struggle for them to even get to that finish line. In the 60s, there are a bunch of really fascinating things that start to happen in American culture that forever change mental health care, our prison system, and even the fabric of our culture. One of those things is that new drugs have arrived from Europe that start to treat psychosis and depression and anxiety in new ways. And there's a movement for sympathy. Let's bring the patients home. Let's get them out of these institutions. Let's close these places that have been snake pits for so long down and get people back home. And they're in popular culture, they're in film in new ways. And so that sympathy starts to transform and to shrink institutions. At the very same time, though, the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement are reaching new heights. There are protests all over the country, and often there's backlash. So Black people being arrested and criminalized for protest. In fact, the one part of the book, I tell the story of 3 civil rights protesters called the Elkton Three, who are committed to, because they are labeled as insane for trying to eat at a white-owned establishment and for refusing to cooperate with authorities after they're arrested. And so, you see the way in which Black protest, even at this moment when there's more sympathy for people who are struggling with their mental health, Black protests and Black complaints and Black concerns about America are actually being criminalized at new heights. And so there are these sort of concurrent and sort of hypocritical shifts happening, and Black people are at the center of them. So one of the things I argue through the lens of Crownsville, through what we saw happen to Crownsville, is that the population that Crownsville served, which even after integration remained majority minority, it's starting to be criminalized in new ways. And that's going to pull their patient population more closely, more into prisons and jails than it is really going to get them back home. And so at the end of the book, I spend time with elders in the community who still to this day drive around Annapolis and Baltimore and different neighboring areas and they see their former patients either living on the street, living in semi-abusive group homes, or having been pulled into one of the local prisons in Maryland because often because of they've been pushed to the brink through crimes of poverty, through a lack of help and continued care, lack of access to medication after they've left these institutions. And so, we're in this moment now where people talk a lot about mental health and self-care. They are concerned about housing inequality and the homelessness crisis in America. But these are not coincidences. We're not seeing these things, and we don't know where they came from. I argue that the asylum and the closure of the asylum and its relationship to the construction of these other systems that have now taken on so much more power and prominence in our culture, that they help us find the answers for why our system has ended up this way, why things feel so broken, particularly in communities of color, particularly to people who are of lower income. But I mean, now, even if you are wealthy, you can find yourself on a very long waiting list to get a new therapist, to get a psychiatrist. There are many who won't even take insurance, even if you have great insurance. And then when you go to institutions or you have to send a loved one somewhere, you could end up with bills for tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is a system that is failing even the wealthy now. And the question is, what do we do about it? What's the roadmap to look at where we let things fall apart? And I think when I would argue, going back to the 60s and looking at some of our decisions around, how do we classify someone now as a patient or as a criminal, as someone who's deserving of mental health care or who needs to be locked up, as someone who we believe can recover and rehabilitate, and someone who we think is just too far gone. These are choices that we've made as a society. They are, and they are different than choices we've made in the past. These are terms that have converged and gotten very blurry and messy. And Crownsville is an amazing way, really, an amazing window into all the choices we made around these social practices, the language that we use, the institutions that we decided to fund or no longer fund. And so if you're wondering where much of our mental health care system has gone today, one of the things I share with people often is, depending on where you are, certainly here in New York City, for example, often your largest provider of mental health care services is actually a place like Rikers, a jail or a prison. And they may work with hospitals and have associations with these groups, but often the first line, front line, a place that people are getting medication or meeting a psychiatrist is behind bars. And that's not a coincidence. A lot of these shifts brought us to this moment.
Yeah, and my only hope is that there are people working in Rikers and institutions and other prisons who are as dedicated and compassionate as the ones you saved and shared with us in your book. And it's a brilliant read, and I recommend it to everyone. We own several copies.
Thank you.
So is there anything you're working on that you'd like us to know about before we say goodbye?
Well, I've received some questions lately from readers about how they can be involved or support Crownsville, how what they can do in their day-to-day lives. And so there's a few messages I'll share. The first is on April 27th this spring, there's going to be a ceremony on Crownsville's campus that's open to the public. Anyone who wants to visit on a Saturday in Maryland, you'll be able to go to Crownsville and actually pay your respects, visit the institution, see some of the people, even meet elders who worked or lived there. And I've gone several times, and I'll be there this year answering readers' questions and talking to people in the county who are now going through the process of turning the property into a memorial site and museum. And they want to hear from people, whether that's nonprofits that work in the mental health care space, or maybe do veterans housing or support for the elderly. They're looking for ideas, for pitches, for organizations to come in and run programs in Maryland that will be open to the public, that will be accessible and fun and supportive for kids and families, and all the way up to the elderly. And they're fielding those calls right now, but they're very eager for people who think they have a good idea or an offering to get in touch. So if you're someone who has a connection to Maryland or an interest or an organization that's expanding, call them because they want to hear from you. And then I think for people who are wondering kind of what to do with this knowledge or what to do with the outrage that you may feel about this system right now, there are a few things that should actually make you feel a bit empowered. The first is, while there's a lot about mental illness, its biology and genetic roots that we don't know, we actually do know a lot about mitigation and the things that we can do for kids and families to prevent people from ever developing these challenges in the first place. Supporting things like libraries, parks, safe, free spaces where kids truly feel welcomed and not overly surveilled or too closely watched and controlled. Too many children are reporting in surveys, according to doctors and psychiatrists that I speak to, that they don't have anywhere to go beyond their school, their home, and their phone. So what you can do to help children actually feel less lonely and feel more supported and loved right now is just support local spaces and the programming they might like to host that would welcome children into those spaces, because so many children are suffering after the pandemic still. The other piece that many doctors and psychiatrists believe is that we could all fold in more simple acts of kindness, patience, support, and outreach to neighbors, to colleagues, to friends who may be suffering. So helping them before it gets to the crisis point, reaching out on their behalf, helping them get on the list for doctors, giving them support. And then, the other piece of all this is translating it into pressure that you put on your local officials, pressure that you put on, candidates who might be in the next couple months visiting your city or town. Demand that they do something about this crisis, demand that they fund these programs, because so long as we live in a place of stigma and shame, and we don't talk about the fact that all of us know people who are suffering or are suffering ourselves. Politicians often don't think they have to do anything if there's no constituency, no valuable group that they have to answer to. But we could build one. We could be one, and this is a very big umbrella, because mental illness, substance abuse, grief, suffering, they don't care about your political background, your racial background, or how much money you have. They come for all of us. And so, where are the opportunities for you to collaborate across the aisle or with neighbors or with people who maybe you don't always hang out with to build something better? The possibilities are there. We don't have to throw our hands up and just accept that this amount of suffering, that these kinds of crises are just the way things have to be in this country. We could all do a little bit more of this kind of work, of this kind of support for our neighbors tomorrow. And I think that that's actually a very hopeful and inspiring thing.
Thanks for listening to the Unpacking 1619. For more information on Heights Library's 1619 Project discussion group, or to check out more interviews with scholars, please visit heightslibrary.org. See you next episode, wherever you listen to podcasts.